I froze when at the company party my wife's lover forcibly took her from me and danced with her in front of me, as if she had never belonged to me, as if I had never been anything more than a detail of a disposable past. His hand on her waist, her eyes lowered, submissive, but not out of shame, out of pleasure. There was no resistance, no hesitation, not even a glance in my direction. It was like watching the end of a movie where the protagonist discovers that he was not the hero, he was just an extra in his own life. I approached them with the world collapsing inside my chest, the sound of the music drowned out by the sound of my heart shattering, and said in the strongest voice I could muster, "I hope the dance is good, I'm going home." I didn't even wait for an answer. I walked through that crowd of hypocritical smiles, fake applause, and looks that pretended not to see anything, and got into the car with shaking hands and a collapsing soul. I got home and went straight to my desk. I didn't cry. I just opened the blue folder, the one she didn't even know existed, and started sorting through the divorce papers. It was easier to deal with the silence of the documents than the noise of disappointment inside my head. She arrived hours later, perhaps drunk on more than just wine. She came into the house looking restless, expecting a scream, a confrontation, maybe even a tear. But I offered none of that. I just looked her in the eyes and said, "Everything is ready. If you want, sign tomorrow." It was at that moment that her castle collapsed. The security of her lover, of the novelty, of the adrenaline, went up in smoke. And there, on the kitchen floor, with her knees bent and her face in her hands, she began to cry. But I didn't cry with her. I stood. Solid. Dry. Just like she taught me to be. In the days that followed, she tried everything. Flowers, dinners, souvenirs that now seemed cheap, like change thrown on a bar table. She called, texted, left notes. She met me in the places I used to go, as if she still knew me. As if it were possible to rebuild a bridge after setting fire to the pillars. But I was no longer that man. The one who waited, who understood, who forgot. I was in transition. My eyes were opening to everything I had lost by being with someone who only saw his own reflection. I started running, traveling, meeting up with friends she avoided. And with each step, with each night I slept peacefully, she became smaller in my memory. The lover disappeared. He disappeared from history like all those who never wanted to stay disappear. He left no traces, no memories. She, alone, was dissolving in desperate attempts to rescue the past, like someone trying to hold water between their fingers. One day, he showed up at my door with a box full of letters. He said he had written them all in the last week. Letters in which he asked for forgiveness, explained, justified, pleaded. I read some. In silence. Others I tore up without reading. Because sometimes forgiveness is not noble. It is simply unnecessary. While she sank into regret, I rose again. And it wasn't for revenge, or pride. It was for survival. I had met someone. Someone who didn't compare me, who didn't ask me to be someone else. Who didn't compete with my story, but walked alongside her. I started laughing again, and the sound of my own laughter scared me at first. Because it had been a long time. Too long. It was like hearing an echo of a man I thought had died. And then the day came. That day. Months later. When she saw me walking hand in hand with another woman. There was no scandal. No scream. Just a long, fixed gaze, filled with a pain that could not fit in my chest. She did not come closer. She stood on the other side of the street, with tears in her eyes and her body stiff, as if she were watching an alternative version of her own life. As if only then, finally, she had understood that betrayal is not just the act, it is everything that comes after it. It is the emptiness. It is the substitution. It is the absence of return. Days later, I received a short message. Now I understand everything. And I knew I didn't need to respond. Because there was nothing more to say. But the most curious part was yet to come. Life, with its sense of cruel irony, had prepared something that not even life, with all its arrogance and manipulation, could have foreseen. A subtle detail, but one capable of destroying any shred of hope. A fact as simple as it was devastating. Something that, when it happened, sealed everything once and for all. What she discovered. I won't say now. Because that's exactly where the story really begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, we never support any form of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fiction, but the feelings are real, created to show how betrayal can destroy homes, hearts and destinies. Get ready now, because what you're about to hear, it's not just a story, is a reality check. Good listening, and hold your breath. For many years, Daniel believed he had won the game of life. Married to the woman he had met when he was still young, he had built a story with her that seemed to follow a script carefully crafted by the gods of emotional stability. Lara was sweet, intelligent and charismatic, and he had a sincere admiration for her ability to adapt to anything, to maintain elegance even in the most boring routines of everyday life. Together, they built a home where every corner held a shared memory, the bookshelf with books they had read together in the silent early hours of the morning, the painting of their trip to Tuscany that they had painted together in an improvised art class, the small crack in the hallway wall that they insisted on not fixing because it had been the result of a silly joke during a renovation. That house had a soul, and the soul was the two of them intertwined in simple, daily gestures. Daniel was methodical, someone who needed predictability to feel secure. He worked as a financial manager for a solid company, kept his schedule with almost military precision, and found comfort in the repetition of rituals, the coffee always prepared the same way, the newspaper read on the porch before leaving for work, the walk at the end of the day with the dog that Lara adopted without asking him, but that quickly became her best friend. She, on the other hand, was more spontaneous and intuitive, and liked to break the routine every now and then, invent new dishes, move the furniture around without warning, and go out on Saturdays without a destination just to explore different streets. This difference between them, instead of creating friction, seemed to balance them. While he landed, she flew. While she colored the world, he offered it structure. In the early years, they lived each phase of their marriage intensely. From the challenges of daily life to professional and personal achievements, they always found time to reconnect with themselves at the end of the day. Daniel had a habit of preparing little surprises even on ordinary days, and Lara would reciprocate with notes hidden in his pants pockets or among the books on her bedside table. There was something funny about that silent way of loving, almost as if they constantly needed to reaffirm the pact they had made without having to say it out loud. And for a long time, that was enough. They didn't need to travel long distances or indulge in luxuries. The simple pleasure of being together was enough for them to continue building their story like someone writing a slow and careful novel, chapter by chapter. Over time, life began to impose its own rhythms. The arrival of two children, Clara and Miguel, brought a new kind of love, but also a reorganization of priorities. Romantic evenings gave way to sleepless nights, long dinners were replaced by quick meals between schoolwork and a hurried bath. Daniel, always responsible, increased his workload to ensure a solid foundation for the family, while Lara masterfully took on the management of the house, the children, and the daily demands that seem invisible until they become unbearable. There was fatigue, without a doubt, and some moments of emotional distance, but they were always overcome by the affection they had for each other and the silent commitment that they never stopped respecting. As the years went by, their routine became more stable. The children grew up, the house became quieter, and the two found themselves once again having time for each other. It was like rediscovering themselves in a new light. They started going out together again, making plans for trips they had previously put off, thinking about a new phase where they could finally take care of each other without rushing. Daniel, more mature, began to appreciate Lara's small gestures even more, like the care she took in leaving his towel folded on the bed or the way she still discreetly got ready to wait for his arrival at night. Lara, in turn, admired his constancy, the way he continued to be predictably attentive, present even when the world seemed to move faster than they should. Their circle of friends was small but trustworthy. They had a few couples they met regularly, and they generally preferred more intimate events, away from crowds. Lara had spent many years away from the job market because of her children, but recently she had returned to interior design, an old passion that now, with more free time, she could rekindle. Daniel supported each project with discreet but sincere enthusiasm. He liked to see her eyes light up when she talked about colors, textures, and ideas for transforming spaces. He himself was surprised by how proud he felt of her, and by the joy it was to see her blossom again. There was also a comfortable silence between them, the kind that only exists between people who know each other very well. There was no need to fill the time with words. A look, a touch on the arm during dinner, an exchange of a smile amidst the noise of everyday life was enough. It was as if they were constantly saying, "We are still here. We are still us." And that, for Daniel, was everything. He never suspected anything, never felt a threat hanging over his marriage. He felt safe, loved, respected. He lived in the certainty that, despite the difficulties they had faced throughout their lives, they had built something solid enough to last the rest of their lives. The harmony seemed unshakable. At dinners with the children, now teenagers, there was still laughter, affectionate teasing, and repeated stories that no one got tired of hearing. Clara said she wanted a love like her parents, and Miguel often took refuge in conversations with his father when he needed to understand how to be a man in the world. Lara, in those moments, observed in silence, as if contemplating her own work with pride. There were no signs, no gaps, no apparent cracks. It was a scenario as perfect as it could be in reality. When they had been married for 20 years, they took a short trip, just the two of them. A weekend at a lakeside inn, with trails and fireplaces, where they rediscovered each other over sips of wine and memories of the time when they were still lovers. They fell asleep cuddling each other, listening to the rain falling outside, and Daniel felt like that moment could last forever. When he got back, he talked to his children about the trip as if he had just experienced something transformative. And Lara smiled the whole time, as if she was exactly where she wanted to be. But time has its own plans, and human relationships are made of layers that we cannot always see. Sometimes, what seems solid carries small cracks that go unnoticed until one day they open up like immense chasms. Sometimes, comfortable silence hides unspoken words that, accumulated, become abysses. And sometimes, blind trust is what allows certain secrets to grow in the shadows. Daniel, at that point in the story, did not know this. There was no reason to distrust. He believed in Lara with the same faith he placed in the sunrise, something that is simply there, every day, without needing to be questioned. That's why what came next wouldn't just be a shock. It would be an earthquake. But for now, there was peace. There was still her scent on the sheets, the sound of her laughter echoing through the house, the notes hidden in the pages of the books. There was still the absolute belief that nothing, absolutely nothing, could destroy what they had built together. It wasn't time to know yet. It wasn't time to see yet. And what no one expected was that, by the time Lara finally repented with her soul in tatters and decided to turn back, life would have already moved on. The heart she tried to win back, was already beating for someone else. But this story, this turning point, this delayed pain, would only come later. And it would come with force. The second half of that year arrived with a strange lightness, as if everything around him was calmer, but not because of serenity, but rather because of a lack of intensity. Daniel had subtly noticed that Lara was more distracted. Small, almost imperceptible things silently bothered him. She forgot to answer simple messages during the day, said she would call but never did, slept later than usual and sometimes woke up too early, with puffy eyes and vague excuses about insomnia or worries about her professional future. These were not alarming signs, at least not for him. Daniel had always had difficulty distrusting those he loved. He observed, interpreted it as tiredness or overwork, and tried hard to be understanding. He thought that perhaps it was time to take another trip, to propose something together, to create a joint project, anything that would bring them back to the complicity that had previously seemed so natural. The atmosphere between them began to change slightly. The morning kiss became automatic. Dinners were silent. Nights were solitary. There were no arguments, and that was a relief for Daniel. But it was also strange. They seemed like two functioning adults living under the same roof, sharing responsibilities, bills, and conversations about their children, but without touching on the core of their relationship. And when he tried to start deeper conversations, about feelings or fears, Lara would dodge him. She would talk about the next day's schedule, about a new client, about something she saw on the internet. And deep down, he accepted it as something temporary. He believed that, as in other difficult times, time would heal. That everything would work out with patience. That love was enough. But this time, it wasn't enough. Lara, on the other hand, seemed increasingly absent from herself. She smiled at family dinners, commented on the news lightly, complimented Daniel's dishes as if she were present, but her gaze wandered. An uncomfortable emptiness hung over her presence. When she was alone, she spent more time in front of the mirror, dressed more carefully even for routine appointments, and had exaggerated reactions when Daniel complimented or, on the other hand, did not comment on her appearance. Sometimes, she would go out in the afternoon for meetings and return 3 hours later than expected, with repeated excuses, traffic, a client being late, an unexpected event on the way. Daniel, as always, listened, accepted, and trusted. It was as if he was still trapped in the image of his old wife, the one who had been his safe haven for so many years. He didn't want to see anything else. He didn't want to think that anything could be too different. The weekends lost their vibrancy. The children, increasingly independent, spent less time at home, and this increased the silence. Daniel suggested that they take a course together, suggested that they resume their habit of walking, invited her to an old movie theater that they both loved. But her refusals were loaded with formal sweetness, and she always had a plausible justification, always with a smile that hid more than it revealed. In an attempt to protect what he believed to still be a happy marriage, he would retreat, withdraw, convince himself that it was just a difficult phase. But some nights, lying next to her without touching her skin, he felt a strange discomfort that he couldn't name. A kind of silent intuition, as if his soul was screaming while his reason drowned out everything. At the company where Lara had been working on some projects as a consultant, a special event was being organized. A big end-of-year party that would bring together clients, employees, and partners. She received the invitation with pent-up excitement and casually mentioned it to Daniel, who was immediately excited. It was the perfect opportunity for them to go out together, reconnect, and perhaps meet again in that lighter, more social environment. She hesitated a bit before agreeing. She said she didn't know if she should mix her work with her personal life, but when she saw his enthusiasm, she gave in. The idea of seeing the two of them side by side, smiling again, was enough for him to spend the following days choosing a suit and planning details, as if that night were a chance to start over. The night of the party arrived with a clear sky and a pleasant breeze. Lara looked stunning. She was wearing a wine-colored dress that Daniel had never seen before, with a discreet slit in the back and a perfume that was different from her usual. He complimented her, took pictures of her with pride, and held her by the waist with renewed affection. In the car, she was quieter than usual, and he attributed this to nervousness about seeing colleagues and clients again. The party was taking place in a modern space, decorated with warm lights, background music, and glasses of sparkling wine circulating in elegant hands. At first, everything went well. They chatted with some guests, laughed together at silly comments, and toasted the end of another year. Lara, however, seemed restless. Her gaze sought something beyond the people around her, and Daniel noticed this. He thought it was anxiety, perhaps a problem with a client. But he didn't ask. He didn't want to seem intrusive. He just observed, in silence. At one point, she walked away. She said she was going to the bathroom, but it took her a while. While Daniel waited for her, he was talking to a nice couple, until he saw her from afar. Lara was leaning against one of the side columns of the room, talking to a man. A tall man, with an expansive smile and gestures that were too intimate to be just professional. He touched her arm naturally, spoke too close to her face. She smiled. A smile that Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. A smile that no longer belonged to him. His stomach turned, but he remained where he was. He wanted to believe that it was just a friend, someone from work, some trivial conversation. But the gestures said more than any words. Time passed and they went to the dance floor. The music got louder, colorful lights filled the room, and everyone around seemed excited. Daniel was near the bar, with a half-empty glass in his hand, when it all happened. The same man approached Lara suddenly, as if it were something previously arranged. He took her hand firmly and led her to dance. He didn't ask permission, he didn't look around. He simply took her for himself, as if she were his property. And instead of backing away, she followed. She let herself be led. She danced lightly, their bodies too close, her eyes focused on the floor. And there was no guilt in that gesture. There was only surrender. Daniel watched the scene paralyzed. The noise of the music became a distant noise. Everything around him seemed to slow down while everything inside him exploded. It wasn't just the dance. It was what it represented. It was the total absence of embarrassment, of retreat, of respect. It was the silent confirmation of everything he had been refusing to see. The betrayal, previously invisible, was now there, exposed in the middle of a party, under artificial lights, among unknown faces that ignored the earthquake happening before them. He walked toward them with firm steps, but his face serene. He got close enough for her to see him, and for a brief second, she froze. But soon he resumed the rhythm of the dance. He didn't shout, didn't ask for explanations, didn't expose anything. He just looked into her eyes and said with deafening calm, "I hope the dance goes well. I'm going home." And he left. When she got home, she sat down at her desk. There was no anger, just a concrete emptiness. She picked up the divorce papers, the same ones she had kept just in case, and began to organize them with a kind of calm that was frightening. She no longer thought about saving anything. There was nothing left to save. What Lara didn't know, and she would discover too late, was that the moment she would finally decide to repent would be exactly the moment he would stop waiting. And that when she returned to try to fix what had broken her, the heart that had once been hers alone would already have found a new path. But what she had no idea, what was still hidden between the lines of that breakup, was that something much bigger, much crueler, was yet to be revealed. And that secret would change everything. Absolutely everything. Lara didn't sleep that night. She spent the dark hours in front of the closed bedroom door, her body pressed against the cold floor of the hallway and her head resting against the wood, listening for any sign of movement coming from inside. She heard nothing. There were no footsteps, no voices, no sighs. Just the harsh silence of someone who no longer wants to be reached. When the sun began to filter through the cracks in the window, she got up slowly, with swollen eyes and trembling hands, and walked to the kitchen as if crossing a battlefield. The table was set, as always, but without the steaming coffee, without the lined-up cutlery, without the small delicacies that for so many years had been part of that invisible routine. She sat down and remained there, motionless, staring at her own absence reflected in the empty cup. Daniel had already left. He didn't leave a note, didn't reply to messages, didn't answer calls. She knew she had crossed a line that wouldn't allow for an easy return. She spent the following days wandering between remorse and hope, oscillating between desperate plans to win him back and the cruel realization that it might be too late. She prepared dinners that he never got to eat, left messages that weren't read, invaded his space with memories and promises that now sounded hollow. But she didn't give up. Because deep down she still believed that there was time, that their love wouldn't dissolve because of a mistake, that all it took was a real opportunity for an explanation. But what she didn't imagine was that time was no longer on her side. Daniel was in another stage of mourning. He was no longer looking for meaning, no longer looking for answers. He just kept going. One afternoon, after almost a week without seeing him properly, Lara waited for him at the gate. He walked up to her, with no surprise in his eyes, as if he had already known she would be there. She tried to smile, tried to touch his hand, tried to say something to break the coldness of the moment, but he only said that he needed space and time. That he was tired of words and preferred actions. That perhaps, in the future, they could talk. And he walked past her as if he were walking past a shadow. In the depths of his eyes, there was something that hurt more than anger, there was indifference. 2 months had passed since the night of the party. The divorce proceedings had begun, the documents were circulating among lawyers, the children already knew about the separation and each reacted in their own way. Clara distanced herself, without hiding her disappointment with her mother, while Miguel tried to maintain a kind of neutrality, as if he didn't want to choose sides. Lara was plunged into bitter regret, reliving scenes from the past, remembering every moment with Daniel as if she could go back in time with the power of memory alone. But the present gave her no respite. The distance between them grew with frightening speed, as if everything they had built was now being swallowed up by a greater, uncontrollable force. It was on a Saturday afternoon, after much insistence, that he agreed to see her to sign the final papers. They met at the same cafe where they used to go with their children, years ago. A place with light walls, the smell of fresh bread and wooden tables that held echoes of happy conversations. She arrived first, with a thin briefcase in her hands and a simple dress, her hair tied up in an unpretentious way. When he entered, she held her breath. He was different. Lighter, with a different kind of presence. There was no longer the weight of sorrow on his face. He seemed whole. And that dismantled her. They spoke little. They signed the documents in awkward silences, interrupted only by practical phrases about assets, agreements, and deadlines. When everything seemed about to end, she took a deep breath, closed the folder slowly and looked into his eyes with a firmness she hadn't felt in weeks. She said she needed to confess something. That there was something he didn't know. Something that had happened after everything, and that she could no longer hide. He frowned, but said nothing. He just nodded, as if allowing the other person to speak, but without expecting much. Lara was shaking. She reached into her bag, pulled out a small photo, folded in half, and placed it on the table. Daniel hesitated for a second before opening it. When he did, the image revealed was simple, him walking in a park, hand in hand with a dark-haired woman, smiling broadly, her steps in sync. Nothing out of the ordinary. But Lara's reaction when he handed it to her was what intrigued him. She said in a broken voice that she knew the woman in the photo. That he had seen that face before, a long time ago. And not by chance. He revealed that she was an old college friend, a long-time acquaintance with whom he had never had a deep connection, but who he knew well enough to remember her name, her story and, most importantly, the connection that had once existed between them. Daniel took a while to understand. He asked if there was something wrong with that woman. If she posed any risk. But what he heard in response made him lose his footing. Lara, with tears in her eyes, revealed that the woman with whom he was now building something new, the one he had met by chance at a charity event, and with whom he had started dating weeks after their separation, was none other than the ex-wife of the man she had cheated on him with. The revelation came like a punch to the stomach. For a moment, Daniel was completely silent. His breathing became shallow, his body tense, his eyes fixed on nothing. He tried to process the absurdity of that coincidence. He asked her how she knew that, and Lara said that she had found out weeks before, when she saw a post by her lover's ex on social media, a casual post about a dinner, a subtle caption, and Daniel's name tagged in the image. She recognized the face immediately. She was overcome by immediate nausea, but instead of telling, she preferred to observe. Until she could no longer keep it in. Daniel spent long seconds in silence. Then he smiled. A strange, bitter smile, as if he recognized the brutal irony of fate. He said he had no idea who she was, that he had never heard of her past, that he had only gotten close to her because of the lightness he felt at her side. That everything had started without any intention of revenge, that there was no plan to settle scores. And that, precisely that, was the most devastating thing for Lara. Because life, with its merciless precision, had given him, without him even asking for it, a kind of poetic justice. A chance to rebuild where she could never have entered. A new beginning that came with something impossible to ignore: he was in love. She begged him to stay away from that woman, saying she couldn't bear to see him with the ex of the man she had thrown everything away for. She asked him to think about his children, what it would mean, the emotional consequences of such a symbolic situation. Daniel calmly replied that it didn't have to make sense to her. That it wasn't about revenge. That, for the first time, he was experiencing something that had nothing to do with pain. And that he wouldn't give it up because of choices that weren't his. Lara tried to argue, she cried, she lost her composure. She said she felt like it was a punishment. That she was being punished in the cruelest way possible. He didn't disagree. He just said that maybe the universe has strange ways of restoring balance. And that she would have to learn to live with the consequences. As they left the cafe, Daniel helped her up, held her hand for a second and looked into her eyes for the last time. He said he hoped she would find herself, that he didn't want her to be unhappy. But that from that moment on, he would follow a path that no longer included her name. Lara shuffled out of there, holding the photograph in her hand, as if it were a sentence. Outside, the sky was blue, but to her, everything seemed dark. She finally understood that losing Daniel had not just been an end, it had been the beginning of something much bigger. And she was no longer a part of it. During the days that followed the conversation in the cafe, Lara began to wander around her own house as if she were in foreign territory. Every object seemed to mock the story that she herself had helped to destroy. The smell of his perfume that still lingered on the towels that had been stored away, the double cups that she herself had chosen on her honeymoon, the photographs that insisted on remaining in the frames, everything betrayed an absence more powerful than the presence itself. But what really destabilized her was no longer Daniel's absence from her routine, but rather the certainty that he had truly found peace in the arms of another. Not just any other. The ex-wife of the lover to whom she had committed her entire life. There was no more perverse script. While she was drowning in guilt and loneliness, he was living what she once thought would last forever, a clean, spontaneous, light love. A love that did not include her lies, her secrets, or the weight of everything she had allowed to happen. That week, Lara received a message from Clara. Her daughter, who was away for a while, proposed a meeting. She accepted with butterflies in her stomach. She knew that Clara had distanced herself after learning of the separation, and even though she had never said it directly, Lara could feel in her daughter's eyes the silent judgment that hurt the most: contempt. They met in a small restaurant with yellowish lighting, where the conversation began coldly, almost formally. Clara spoke slowly, bluntly, as if she had rehearsed it. She said that she still loved her, that she was her mother, but that since the betrayal, she had started to see her in a different way. That she had lost some of the admiration she felt, and that she was trying to understand if it was possible to rebuild the bond between them. Lara did not defend herself. She just listened, with tears in her eyes and bated breath. At the end of the conversation, Clara hugged her, but it was a tense, distant hug, like someone who still doesn't know whether to stay or go. When they separated, Lara felt that, little by little, even her children were no longer recognizing her. At the same time, Daniel was following his own path, but not without his own conflicts. Despite being involved in a new relationship and feeling something real for Helena, the woman who had appeared unexpectedly, filling spaces he didn't even know were empty, there were still ghosts that haunted his decisions. He wondered about the chance that had brought him together with the ex-wife of the man who had been the pivot of the destruction of his marriage. He couldn't understand if it was fate, irony, or just life with its cruel humor. He spoke to Helena about it only once, and she responded with a firm calmness that disconcerted him. She said that, at that moment, what mattered was what they were building together. That the past, although painful, had been the soil on which something new was now growing. And that she had no interest in reliving old hurts. Daniel realized there the most brutal difference between her and Lara: the absence of manipulation. Helena didn't dramatize, didn't demand, didn't position herself as victim or heroine. She was simply sincere. And that was enough. The relationship between the two evolved discreetly, without urgency or pressure. It was a calm romance, but full of emotional intensity. They talked about everything: failures, fears, dreams, and even mistakes they had both made in their past lives. There were no exaggerated promises or promises of eternity, but there was truth. For the first time, Daniel found himself in front of a woman who didn't need him to be anything other than what he was. And that, for a man who had spent years trying to maintain an idealized version of himself, was liberating. However, the peace would not last long. One autumn afternoon, while having coffee in a bookstore with Helena, Daniel received a call from Miguel. His son's voice was distressed, and without going into too much detail, he asked him to go to Lara's apartment. He said she was not well. Daniel left immediately, without asking anything. When he arrived, he found the door ajar and the room in darkness. Lara was sitting on the floor, surrounded by torn papers, old letters, and photos scattered like the wreckage of an emotional shipwreck. Her eyes were sunken, her lips were trembling, and an empty bottle of wine was next to her. She was not drunk, but there was something about her that frightened him, an exhaustion that bordered on surrender. Daniel approached her slowly, knelt in front of her, and touched her hand. She did not back away. She simply began to speak, as if she had finally allowed herself to bleed with words. She said she could no longer pretend she was okay. That she saw Daniel rebuilding his life and felt that everything around her was falling apart. She said she loved him. That she had always loved him, even when she didn't know how to show it. That what she did was a mistake, yes, but that it didn't erase the beautiful story they had built. That she even missed the silences between them. And that, even though she knew there might be no going back, she needed him to hear that, at least once. Daniel didn't interrupt. He just listened, his eyes fixed on her, without expressing judgment, without offering comfort. When she finished, he sighed deeply and said in a low voice that he understood her pain. That he also missed many things. But that the love that existed between them was now a memory. And that he had learned to love the present. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. But out of necessity. Lara then said something that would change everything again. She looked into his eyes with a pain that seemed ancient and confessed that she had tried to look for him the week before, but that she had seen him in the distance, holding hands with Helena, smiling. And at that moment, she was sure that she had lost him forever. She said that at that moment, she did not feel jealous. She felt envy. Not for the woman, but for the Daniel she had never met. A free, light, whole Daniel. Who had been reborn from a pain that she had caused. And who was now too far away for her to reach. Daniel calmly replied that no one is the same after a fall. And that, sometimes, the greatest gift in life is precisely what seems like punishment, the chance to start over from scratch. Before leaving, he helped her organize the papers, put the photographs in a box and led her to the sofa. He told her that she needed to seek help, to get her life back on track, to rebuild her story. Not for him. But for herself. Lara, with tears in her eyes, just nodded. For the first time, she didn't ask for anything else. She just accepted. In the following days, Lara began therapy. She resumed her office visits. She began visiting her children more frequently, without making demands, just being present. It was as if she was finally understanding that the pain needed to be lived through to the end so that healing could take place. Daniel, in turn, continued his routine with Helena, but now with the lightness of someone who has closed a chapter without leaving any loose ends. Weeks later, one Sunday afternoon, as they walked together through a park, Clara saw them. From a distance, she saw her father smiling, engaged in a quiet conversation, holding the hand of a woman she recognized. Not as a family friend. But as someone who, in some way, was part of her own story. Clara did not approach him. She walked home in silence and texted her mother. She simply said, "I understand now. And I forgive." Lara read the message with a lump in her throat. She replied with a, "Thank you. I knew it would still take time, but perhaps, little by little, the bonds would be rebuilt in a different way. Not like before. But with truth." And that, in the end, was what mattered most. That same day, at dusk, Daniel and Helena were sitting on the balcony of their apartment, drinking tea. Helena looked at him with that serene look and said that she felt they were exactly where they should be. Daniel smiled, squeezed her hand and said that, after everything, he finally understood the value of peace. And that, even though the past was always there, haunting, it no longer had power over what was to come. Because sometimes, justice does not come through the hands of a judge, nor through harsh words. Sometimes, justice comes through life, silently returning exactly what was taken away. And, at that moment, life seemed to have given him back the rarest of gifts, himself. The following weeks were marked by a strange calm, as if after a devastating storm the whole world was on hold, taking a deep breath before starting over. Daniel continued with his routine, but there was a weight on his face that did not come from sadness, but from a new awareness. He was no longer the same man he had been months ago, and not because he had become stronger or more confident, but because he now carried the certainty that love does not guarantee permanence, that bonds do not last only with good intentions, and that sometimes the only way to move forward is to accept that the past cannot be fixed, only understood. There was a kind of cautious serenity in his eyes, the kind that only comes after pain has been well faced, and this made each small gesture of his more intentional, more mature. He no longer looked for someone to blame, no longer wanted justice, he simply tried to make sense of everything that was still pulsing inside him. Helena, in turn, also felt the repercussions of what they had experienced. Despite maintaining a firm and balanced posture, deep down she was processing the symbolic dimension of what it meant to be with Daniel, a man who was still, in part, shaped by the marks of a history she knew all too well. She had experienced the end of her own marriage as a woman betrayed, publicly humiliated by someone she swore to love, and now she found herself in an unexpected situation, where the love that had been born within her blossomed alongside a man who, although sincere, carried bonds that were difficult to untie. There was, yes, affection and genuine desire, but there were also unanswered questions and the silent restlessness of someone who knows that, even when experiencing something new, one cannot build a future on ruins that have not been resolved. It was on a cloudy Saturday that Lara unexpectedly appeared at the door of Daniel's new apartment. Helena wasn't there, and for a brief moment, when she saw him open the door with a surprised face, she felt something that she didn't know if it was relief or shame. She asked for just 5 minutes. Daniel hesitated, but made room. He entered as if he were entering forbidden territory, without knowing exactly what to say, but with the clarity that there was something that needed to be done. They sat on the balcony, where the wind blew with an almost uncomfortable gentleness, and for a few minutes they just looked at the horizon, as if there lay the answer to everything that had been lost. Then Lara began to speak, not with the tone of someone begging, but with the lucidity of someone who has already understood what they have lost. She said she was finally learning to be alone, that she was facing the shadows she had always avoided, and that in this painful process she began to see clearly everything she had stopped valuing. She said that in therapy she revisited her marriage not from the perspective of guilt, but from the perspective of responsibility. That she understood how small negligences and emotional distractions made room for the bigger mistake. That her betrayal did not come out of nowhere, but from an accumulation of emptiness that she herself helped to create. She did not justify it, but contextualized it. And, more than anything, she wanted him to know that she no longer expected reconciliation. She was there because she needed to truly ask for forgiveness, without ulterior motives, without any expectation of anything in return. She just wanted to free him from any weight he might still carry because of her. Daniel listened attentively, but in the end, he simply thanked her. He said he accepted her apology, but that for him, the most important thing was not to hear that, but to realize that she had finally understood the impact of her choices. He said that no one is perfect, that he himself had failed in many ways during their marriage, and that perhaps the most tragic thing of all was precisely the fact that they both learned too late. For a moment, there was a silence that did not hurt. A mature, serene silence, the kind that does not need to be filled with promises. When Lara got up to leave, the two looked at each other for a long time, and in that wordless exchange, she knew that this would be the last time they would see each other alone. And, surprisingly, she felt peace about it. In the following days, Daniel and Helena took a short trip. They went to a quiet town in the countryside, where they could take a break from their routine and observe themselves more closely. There, during a simple lunch by a stream, she asked him if he still thought about Lara. Without hesitation, he said he did. Not with longing, but with gratitude for what he had learned and for the clarity he now had about himself. He said he no longer carried bitterness, only a deep awareness that one cannot change another person, only choose whether or not to stay by their side. Helena listened in silence, and then replied that she was not afraid of his past, but that she needed to know that the present was whole. Daniel smiled, took her hand and said that he had never been so present in his own life as he was now. And that this, in itself, was the greatest commitment he could offer. Meanwhile, Lara continued her process of rebuilding. She rediscovered her love of work, took courses, reinvented her home, and rebuilt her routine. There was something melancholic about her days, it's true, but there was also strength. She began to see her children more naturally, and little by little their bond began to grow, without big speeches, but with consistent gestures. Miguel began to visit her more often, sometimes just for dinner, other times to chat about trivial things. Clara was still more distant, but she no longer avoided his messages, she even smiled in some of his responses. And for Lara, this was a silent victory. She discovered that forgiving others begins when we begin to forgive ourselves. And although there were still open wounds, there was also more fertile soil where she could, who knows, one day, sow something new. In a chance encounter at the market, weeks later, Lara and Helena saw each other face to face for the first time. The moment was awkward but brief. They greeted each other with a subtle nod, without exchanging words. In Lara's eyes, there was respect. In Helena's, firmness. It was the kind of situation neither of them wanted, but which they both knew was inevitable. And, in some strange way, there was also something like a mutual understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the pain each had experienced on opposite sides of the same war. Over time, Daniel and Lara's story stopped being a topic of conversation between friends. What was a tragedy became a memory, what was anguish became a lesson learned. People moved on with their lives, and so did they. Daniel began giving lectures on emotional management in companies, something he had never thought of doing before, and saw it as a way to transform his pain into something constructive. Helena began supporting him on these journeys, offering emotional support, sharing her life with ease and complicity. They were no longer just a couple born from a painful coincidence. They were two survivors of different stories who had chosen to walk together. And then, on a quiet evening, after dinner at home with his children, Daniel walked out onto the balcony, took a deep breath, and watched the city lights slowly fade away. He felt that the cycle was ending, not with a rupture, but with a peaceful surrender. A new beginning. Helena hugged him from behind, and he held her hands tightly. He thought about how much he had changed. How much he had learned to recognize his own fragility without being ashamed. About the courage to let go of what was no longer there, without losing the ability to love what would become. Meanwhile, Lara, in her new apartment, wrote in a notebook she had started using in therapy. She wrote about herself, about her fears, about love. She wrote not to keep it, but to remember who she had been and who she wanted to be from then on. When she finished, she closed the notebook slowly, put it on the shelf and turned off the light. She slept peacefully, for the first time in a long time, without expecting anything from anyone. And in that intimate silence, she realized that perhaps, just perhaps, the greatest form of love is knowing how to let go, and leaving the other person free to be happy, even without you. That night when Lara turned off the light and slept in silence, Daniel also closed his eyes in a room where, for the first time, he no longer carried the weight of the past. Time, with its patient ability to heal what seemed irreparable, had finally leveled his emotions. The longing had turned into memory, and the anger had disappeared like fog on a warm morning. Now, all that was left was acceptance. But acceptance didn't mean forgetting, it simply meant moving on. And moving on, sometimes, hurt less than fighting for something that no longer existed. He woke up early the next day, with Helena still asleep by his side, and for the first time in a long time he felt like doing something that was just his, without anyone's interference, without a shadow of expectations. He took the car keys, left a loving note on the table, and left without making a sound. He drove to the coast, where he used to take his family on vacation, and sat on the sand, alone, facing the sea. There, facing the vast blue expanse and the rhythmic sound of the waves, he realized that he was ready to close that cycle once and for all. And he didn't need witnesses. He just needed to allow himself to be at peace with life exactly as it was. Meanwhile, Lara reorganized her routine more firmly. She started attending social events again, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to reconnect with those she had pushed away out of shame. She discovered that many who had previously seemed distant were willing to welcome her back, as long as she came back looking different. And she did. More humble, more sensitive, less vain. She started going out with a group of old friends, with whom she had lost contact during the years in which she prioritized marriage, children, and the image of a perfect life. On those nights, between sincere conversations and light laughter, she felt that there was still something inside her capable of blossoming. On one of these occasions, a friend introduced her to a writer who gave creative writing workshops. She was interested, not in him, but in the idea. She enrolled in a course and began writing fictional letters. She discovered that she could put down on paper things that she would never be able to say out loud. Little by little, she began to realize that writing was not only a relief, it was also a form of reconstruction. During a class, the professor read an excerpt from one of her texts and praised her for her raw emotions. He said it was rare to see someone write with so much pain without hiding behind metaphors. Lara smiled and thanked him, but didn't mention that the excerpt was based on the night she saw Daniel dance with Helena for the first time, in a square, under soft evening lights, in a devastating coincidence. She didn't say that she watched them for more than 10 minutes, hidden behind a lamppost, watching his gestures, the way he touched her face, his eyes closed as he gently twirled her around. It was poetry, but it was also punishment. That scene haunted her for weeks, and now she had turned it into words. It was the only way to make it hurt less. Meanwhile, Helena was beginning to face her own ghosts. Despite being confident and loving, she was not immune to the echoes of everything she was building alongside Daniel. Sometimes, when he was lost in thought, she felt Lara's presence still hovering in some corners of the house, even if invisible. Not out of jealousy, but out of respect for the weight that previous love still carried. One night, the two of them were in the kitchen preparing dinner when she asked, in a calm voice, if Daniel believed that he had really ended everything with his ex-wife. He answered sincerely, he said yes, but that didn't mean that she wouldn't live forever in a part of his story. And that maybe, truly loving someone was exactly that, accepting that he carries baggage that can't be discarded, only reorganized. Helena smiled, and instead of arguing, she simply reached out to him and said that she didn't want to be the woman who erased stories, but rather the one who helped build the next one. The children were also beginning to change their attitudes. Clara was gradually getting closer to her mother. It wasn't easy, but time, along with Lara's sincere efforts, began to break down the emotional barrier that had formed between them. One day, Clara called her just to tell her some good news about work. After that, they started seeing each other more often, having lunch together, and exchanging confidences. Miguel, always more observant, was happy to see this rekindling of relationships and confided in his father that he felt that, finally, everyone was finding their new place. Daniel heard this with relief. Because, in the end, what he feared most was that his children would carry the fragments of a marriage destroyed by resentment. Now, he saw that there was reconstruction, even in the ruins. One afternoon, Miguel showed up at his father's house with an envelope in his hands. He said it was a gift from his mother. Inside was a letter. Not a letter of love, nor a request. Just a letter of gratitude. It said that she saw him, from afar, lighter, more whole. And that she wished, from the bottom of her heart, for him to be happy. That she now understood that love was not enough when there was no respect and truth. And that, even though it hurt, she accepted that she had lost not by bad luck, but by choices. And that she hoped that, one day, he would be able to read those words and feel that, at least in the end, she understood everything. Daniel read the letter in the silence of the office. At the end, he took a deep breath and put the paper in a drawer. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just felt that, finally, everything fit together. Helena realized, a few days later, that there was something different about him. She didn't ask what it was. She just sat down next to him, rested her head on his shoulder, and stayed there. Daniel held her hand and whispered that he wanted to travel with her. He said it wasn't an escape, but a symbol. He wanted to start a new phase. A new place, a new house, a different routine. And, for the first time, Helena accepted without hesitation. They began to plan a move, perhaps to a smaller city, where they could live more simply, with more space, and less noise. It was the necessary closing of a cycle, but also the celebration of a possible new beginning. The day before the trip, Daniel stopped by his old house to pick up some documents. He found Lara waiting at the door. There was no resentment in her eyes. Just a calm tiredness, a maturity that had not existed before. They exchanged a few words. She wished him luck. He thanked her. They were silent for a few seconds and then hugged, like two acquaintances sharing a memory that no longer hurts. And it was there, in that silent embrace, that Daniel understood that it was no longer about loving or not loving. It was about accepting. And accepting, after all, was the greatest act of love possible. The next morning, he and Helena left. In the back seat, there were a few suitcases. In their eyes, there was the lightness of someone who knows they don't need to forget in order to move forward. With them, the whole world seemed to be reorganizing itself. And what had seemed impossible months ago was now simply life, starting over, with all its irony, beauty and unpredictability. Lara, from the top of her new apartment, watched the sky with a cup of tea in her hands and a discreet smile on her lips. She wasn't completely happy. But she was alive, aware, and finally at peace with her own story. And that, for her, was enough. When Daniel and Helena's car crossed the border of the new city, there was a strangely serene energy in the air, as if time had waited until that moment to grant them true silence. The chosen place was not touristy nor surrounded by promises of a perfect life, it was simply calm, honest in its simplicity, with tree-lined streets and small cafes where strangers still exchanged smiles like old friends. There, Daniel opened the windows of his new home with the physical sensation that the past had finally been left behind. The still bare walls awaited new stories, and the days that followed were filled with rituals that did not remind him of the man he once was, long walks with no destination in mind, guilt-free dinners, conversations that did not seek conclusions, but simply presence. Helena became part of their daily lives in an organic way, not as someone who occupies an empty space, but as someone who helps to build a new space. The complicity between the two was made up of small and profound gestures, like sharing a silence without discomfort or laughing at memories that no longer hurt. She knew that the man sleeping next to her carried an intense history, but she never tried to change it, she just chose to be his gift with integrity and lightness. Lara, in turn, consolidated her reconstruction not with declarations or major changes, but with consistency. She published a small book with the texts written during the course, a collection of fictional letters that, for her, represented not characters, but parts of herself that needed to be understood, accepted and finally released. The book circulated modestly, but it brought her a different kind of recognition, not social, but personal. For the first time, she felt whole, outside of the role of wife, mother or repentant woman. She felt like someone who had picked up the pieces and made a new way of being out of them. She began giving lectures on emotional reconstruction for women, speaking openly about failures, choices, and forgiveness. She never presented herself as a victim or as an example. She simply told the truth, with an honesty that provoked admiration. It was at one of these events that she met Raphael, a journalist who was moved by one of her speeches and, after exchanging a few words with her, felt that there was something rare there, someone who didn't want to be saved, but just seen. Their approach was slow, without urgency, with respect for the scars they both carried. Raphael was not a replacement, nor a symbol of redemption. He was just someone who walked alongside, without promising shortcuts. And, for Lara, that was more than enough. Clara, after a long time avoiding unresolved emotions, finally sat down with her mother for a long conversation. It was a silent night, on the living room sofa, with warm tea in her hands and her heart exposed between her words. She said that she forgave him, yes, but that forgiveness did not erase the pain, it only changed the way she would move forward. She respected her mother's efforts to rebuild herself, and that she recognized her courage in facing the consequences of her own actions with such dignity. Lara listened to everything in silence, with tears in her eyes and a relieved heart. At the end, the two embraced in a way that was no longer fragile, but mature, conscious, like women who recognize themselves in each other's flaws. Miguel, more reserved, expressed his affection in his own way, inviting his mother to lunch on Sundays, laughing more during visits, recommending books he read, and demonstrating, without needing to say it, that their love had never stopped existing. Lara's ex-lover, the one who had been the point of imbalance in so many lives for so long, had followed a very different path. After the scandal, he tried to keep his public image intact, but the coldness with which he dealt with the consequences of the betrayal distanced him from colleagues, friends, and even his own family. Little by little, he began to realize that the impact of the betrayal did not end in the bedroom or in secret encounters, but echoed in all the bonds that sustained life outside of lies. He tried to get back together with his ex-wife, but she had already found another path and had no interest in looking back. He now lived alone, surrounded by empty conquests, accumulating memories of a time when he believed himself invincible. And this, perhaps, was the greatest punishment, being alive, but invisible to those who once saw him with admiration. One day, months after moving, Daniel received an envelope with no return address. When he opened it, he found only a photo, him, Lara and their children on an old trip, all smiling in front of a forgotten landscape. On the back, handwritten, was just one sentence: "Thank you for being my story." He kept the photo in a drawer, without sadness. He knew it was the end of a chapter that, as painful as it had also been important. And that now, finally, he could rest in the past without stealing anything from the present. On the porch of their new home, Daniel and Helena watched the sunset with bare feet and a peaceful heart. Life wasn't perfect. There were still bills, small annoyances, and daily challenges. But there was truth. And where there is truth, there is room for love to blossom. Looking at her, Daniel understood that everything he had experienced before had prepared him to be there, at that very moment. And that sometimes, the most just ending is not the one where you go back to the beginning, but the one where you find a new path, far from everything you once dreamed of, but much closer to what you needed. And Lara, one late afternoon, walked into a street cinema alone, with a small popcorn and a light coat. She watched a romantic film, and during the final credits, she let a single, discreet tear fall. It wasn't sadness. It was just emotion. She felt alive. Ready. And perhaps, for the first time in many years, I felt like I didn't owe anyone anything. Betrayal had destroyed the home, yes. But it hadn't destroyed her ability to be reborn. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. If you've made it this far, I'd like to invite you to comment on what you thought of this story. Which character touched you the most? What would you do in their place? Leave your opinion in the comments, it's very important for us to continue bringing stories like this. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel, activate the bell so you don't miss any new stories. And before I close, I want to leave you with a very serious thought: betrayal is like an invisible crack. It starts small, almost imperceptible, but when it spreads, it ruins everything it touches. It destroys trust, dignity, family ties, and even the self-esteem of the person who is hurt. No momentary pleasure is worth the price of a broken heart, disoriented children, or an entire life being rebuilt from the rubble. Here on the channel, we make it clear, we do not support and will never romanticize any type of betrayal. Our stories are fiction, yes, but the feelings portrayed are real, intense, and reflect consequences that life imposes without mercy. Until the next story, and remember, those who love, do not deceive.